Welcome everybody to the 2023 South Dakota Emerald Ash Borer update as part of the Forest Health Workshop series led by the Forest Health team. I'm your moderator, Tony Seidel, and with us as always, Dr. John Ball, Forest Health Specialist and SDSU Extension Forester. Today, Dr. Ball will be going over the status of Emerald Ash Borer, an invasive pest that has been found in our state in 2018, and he'll bring us up to date on the bug, on the life cycle, where it can be found, and what we can expect here in the future. So this webinar is being recorded. The workshop will be edited down and put on our YouTube page for later viewing. For anybody interested in SAF or ISA CEU credits, you can include your Society of American Forester certified forester number in the chat box before the end of this workshop, and any ISA certified arborists, you can expect a certification code to be presented at the end of the workshop, which you then can self-submit on the ISA website for that credit. We'll have time for questions at the end. If you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in our chat box, and we'll try to address as many as we can with our time of about an hour. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Ball.
All right. Well, thank you, Tony. I'll click this on to share, and we'll get this going here. Just a second. Let's see here if it's going to do it. All right, is it showing up, Tony?
Yes, I see it.
Okay. All right, thanks. All right, well, thank you, everybody. I'm doing it remote today. I'm out getting ready to do a tree planting in Bryant, South Dakota, and it's kind of nice that I'm doing it today in that when EAB started showing up around South Dakota, the eastern edge, they contacted me and said, hey, we're kind of concerned about that. And I like that, they're thinking ahead. And we did a survey for a town of 500. They had more than 600 ash trees, so more than one per person. They've already removed about 100 and some. Now, again, the old trees, the ones that were declining anyway, the ones no one would treat. And today we're planting a bunch of new trees, the Northern Sentinel honey locust, for example, espresso coffee tree, heritage oak. So again, the idea is to diversify. But today, let's go look a little bit at what's going on with EAB. And a good reminder that South Dakota Department of Ag and Natural Resources does have a website, which is right on there, emeraldashborerinsouthDakota.org, that you can always find the latest information on. And one of the bits of latest information is always the current quarantine list for the state of South Dakota. Well, we all are probably pretty familiar with what a tree looks like that's infested, so I won't spend a lot of time on that. But I want you to look at this tree, and this is a classic tree infested with emerald ash borer that I took in Lincoln County. Now, I want you to think about that. It wasn't that I took it in a town in Lincoln. The infestation there is kind of spreading throughout the county itself. And if you look at this tree, it has that, I almost call it a halo. There's an outer edge of thinning branches, and then there's almost a gap. And then below that, an area of very thick, dark green water sprouts. Now, when you see a tree that looks like that, it's been infested for probably, maybe 4 or 5 years. Maybe 3, depending on the level of infestation, but that certainly isn't this year, the first year. So we do get these things showing up, but if you ever see a tree that looks like that, take a picture of it, email it to me, text it to me. That's certainly one I want to follow up on, because I have found some other cases where it's someone put a chain around the trunk and girdled the tree just as effectively as the insect would do. But usually this is how we find them, a tree that looks like that, and we start scraping the bark, and lo and behold, we find the larvae. Of course, the other good indicator is woodpeckers. They're our best pointers for emerald ash borer. The woodpeckers love the taste of emerald ash borer. They will shred that outer layer of bark And then there are drill holes going in for the larvae, and they almost never miss. So finding these two types of symptoms where the tree has that dark green base with a thin upper canopy, and then you look closer, there's woodpecker damage on that. That's almost always, didn't say always, but almost always a tree infested with emerald ash borer. Well, what are we going to do about management? Now, again, it's not found in Watertown, South Dakota yet, but the day it is, there's going to be problems because look at that street. That's all ash. And that's going to change, certainly within the next 5 or 10 years, as emerald ash borer moves throughout the state.
Good. What can I help you with?
And then if you take a look at here, this is a community that has emerald ash borer. We confirmed it in it about 2 years ago, and we're already getting standing dead trees. And so once it arrives in the smaller communities, it tends to move much faster than it does in a city the size of Sioux Falls that has a lot of ash to absorb an infestation almost anywhere in the city. It doesn't have to move beyond it. We're small towns that kind of covers the whole town within a year or so. But the reason I say failure is not an option, because if we do nothing, this is what happens. We're not quite seeing that yet, though we have seen some of this already in Lincoln County. But I got to show you this picture. I took this picture in Rochester, New York, which is a little ahead of us in the EAB curve. But what you're looking at there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and there were 2 more, so there were 8 standing dead ash that had been infested by emerald ash borer. The removal cost was $8,000 a tree. So think of this, 2 backyards, $64,000. Why? Because at that point, they're very brittle. In fact, 2 had already failed. And so communities just can't wait for this problem to happen. It has to be managed, and that means getting ahead of it rather than chasing it. And we're already seeing windbreaks too. This is an windbreak showing those classic symptoms in Lincoln County. Lincoln and Minnehaha County, it's fairly easy to find the infestation throughout the counties at this point. Well, why is emerald ash borer so lethal? Well, I'm going to start by going back to China, where I've done some work there. And there I am up in northeastern China, where emerald ash borer is native. And there you can find ash. There's about 3 or 4 different species. But I only find infested ash when the trees are highly stressed or overmature. And that's what this type of insect does. It attacks dying trees and swiftly kills them. The only time you're going to find a lot of dying trees from emerald ash borer over there is if you go into towns like Shenyang. That does not look like a good environment to be a tree, does it? And sure enough, there you can find many of their small ash trees that are being infested with emerald ash borer because they're already stressed. Now, the problem is when that insect arrived in our country, it recognized our ash as suitable host, but our ash did not have any real effective defenses against it. And so when you look, our mortality rate for green ash is going to be very similar to other communities, and that is within 10 years of the epidemic, you lose about 100% of them. 100% of your black ash, and we still have some communities with those. Now, right off the bat, you'll lose about 98% of your white ash. But you might say, well, that means 2% live. No, they linger, and that's why we call them lingering ash. Here I am standing at just about where they first found emerald ash borer in Canton Township, Michigan. It was found there, confirmed there in the year 2002. Now, it appears to have been there for maybe 5 to 10 years beforehand. But when you go out there, you'll still find ash. And look at this. Here's a lingering white ash in Southfield that I took a picture of in 2017. That tree had gotten fairly large, and you think, oh my gosh, they live. There's the same tree 5 years later. It's dead. So what it means is about 2% of the white ash live a little longer, but eventually they all die as mature plants, and ash becomes the shrub layer. When you go into Chicago suburbs, those are ash trees. Every alleyway, along fence lines and that, you'll find ash. and they get big enough to produce seed before they're killed by EAB. So once emerald ash borer arrives in your community, it will always be in your community, though at a much lower density because the ash population, but ash will become a shrub rather than a tree. Well, what kills them? I mean, what kills emerald ash borer? They're so effective at killing ash. Must be something that'll kill them. Well, natural enemies, the parasitoids, may kill off about 20% of them. It doesn't appear quite that high here, but they are some help, and I mean some help in their release. The problem is, and there's one that landed on me during our releases, is if you look at that little tail it has, that ovipositor, the problem they have in this country is they have to slide that underneath the bark to inject it into a larvae. The bark is too thick on our ash trees. They can only attack them up in the canopy. Because if you look at the bark on a regular ash tree in this country, it's way too thick. They can't exert it that far in. So there are limitations, and they're not as cold hardy as the emerald ash borer is. Predators. Okay, woodpeckers, which are highly effective at that. They'll take about 30%. So we've killed about half of them already. And as I mentioned, they're very effective at finding and taking out emerald ash borers. And what about winter cold? Well, we've talked about this in the past, and yes, we did have a long, hard winter, but it wasn't extremely cold except for a couple of time periods. If you take a look, here was our old number. I want you to remember that, our old number. You'd kill 99% at minus 30. What does that mean? That means 1% lives. The 1% that lives are the ones that breed. What are we building? A more cold hardy bug. And the Canadians have now had survival at minus 40. Minus 40. So the idea that our South Dakota winters are going to prevent the problem in some communities, no. It will slow the problem because you'll still kill quite a few. But think of this. Every cold winter, some survive. And those are the ones that perpetuate the next generation. So even though in China, minus 20 is kind of the cutoff, here it's about minus 40 because there's always some that survive and they're going to always be a little cold hardier. So let's not depend on winter or even look at winter in the future of being much help. So what can be done? Really emphasize two things. One, reduce ash populations. You're reducing the available phloem, the available food source for them. With communities that are 1/3 ash, or in some cases 1/2 of their street trees being ash, you've got a tremendous food resource there, far more than they would see normally in any environment. And so what happens, their populations can build to abnormally high densities, and they can quickly overwhelm the local tree population. The others treat valuable ash trees. And I think ash is a valuable tree for communities to maintain. It's not that I want it to completely disappear. Now, again, treatments are effective. And I'm not saying let's treat every ash tree out there. Why? Because there's a lot of over mature declining ash anyway, trees that we wouldn't want to maintain at any rate, nor do I want to maintain 40% of a community's tree population as ash. But a smaller percentage, absolutely. Absolutely. And if there's light at the end of the tunnel, the light is as the density of the ash population declines, the density of the insect declines. And what we find in other communities is that they can keep stretching the time between injections because there's less pressure on the remaining trees. Some communities are going every 5 or 6 years now for injections. Now, not in South Dakota. We're still at every other year because our populations are building. But it's not that people are going to have to treat every 2 years for a long, long, long time, for about the first 10, and then it'll start stretching out. Again, a reminder, we only recommend treating ash trees that are in one of our quarantine counties, which are Lincoln, Minnehaha, Turner, and Union County now. Or if your tree happens to be within 15 miles of an infestation. But boy, do they work. Now, there's a tree on the left-hand side of the screen that was near ground zero in 2018. In other words, the year we confirmed emerald ash borer. Now, the emerald ash borer was there, what we believe now, about 4 years earlier. So 2014, it was there. And obviously, this tree had been infested before we found it. And you can see it's declining back. When that tree was found, and it looked like that, it was treated. And you can take a look at that same tree in the year 2022. And so the trees can recover if they've been treated. If they're lightly infested, once we confirm in a community, you can treat them and bring them back and then maintain them, but it's about every 2 years. So the treatments, as I point out here, are highly effective, even on trees that were already infested before you got started. And now this is 5 years out of date, but it's still kind of interesting to look at. Back when we first found emerald ash borer, first confirmed it, we got about 228 quotes from people in Sioux Falls that had a quote to remove their ash tree and a quote to treat their ash tree. And I broke them out by diameters. And what I want you to notice is on large trees that are about 20 to 30 inches in diameter to about 4.5 feet above the ground. At that time, 5 years ago, it was about $1,400 to $2,800 to remove those trees, depending on the difficulty. Look at the treatment costs. It's not that bad. Where if you take a look at the small diameter trees, well, who's going to spend, you got a tree that's going to cost you $450 to take down. It's going to cost you $160 to treat it. Well, maybe I'll remove those trees. But the point of this is that trees larger than 20 inches, it made economic sense to keep those trees. It would take more than 20 years in some cases for the cost of treatments. In other words, the cost of removing it now would be the same of cost of treating it over the next 2 decades. And you had that shade, right? You didn't have to start with a new tree. So I'm one that does recommend treatments, as many others do. And I will say the city of Sioux Falls, in the city of Sioux Falls, there are lots of people that are having their trees treated, and really professionally is the only way to get your trees treated. And if they're little trees like this, they're already stressed, they're declining, just remove and replant. There's no point in trying to maintain this tree. But the larger trees, more than 20 inches, that are nice looking trees, a real benefit to the homeowner, absolutely treat. Well, on those treatments, what we found in Sioux Falls and a number of other locations is that the effectiveness of the treatments depends on really who did it. And by who did it, I mean that you hired a commercial applicator. This is not a time for do-it-yourselfers, not for any tree bigger than 4 or 5 inches in diameter. And kind of the rules are treat them early. In other words, just after leaf out, which is occurring now in the southern part of our state, low, right at the root flare, and shallow, just into the sapwood. And when you have someone come out and treat a tree, those are the best ways and times to treat. Now, ideally, we do all our treatments right about now, when the leaves first begin to open. Why? Because that's when water is being pulled up through the sapwood, and we need that water moving in the sapwood to pull up the chemical that is injected. What's interesting on ash, and this is my little artwork of the interior of an ash tree, is those kind of bluish dots there. Those represent the early wood vessels, the tubes that carry water up. Ash trees, which are ring porous, we call them, they produce a solid ring all the way around, have produced their new tubes that carry up water before the leaves come out. Okay, before the leaves come out. So if you wait till leaf out, all those tubes have already been constructed. They're going to pull the chemical up through the tree. And then let's take a look at emerald ash borer life cycle. And I can go fairly quickly over this, but it's still worth going over, particularly when we look at treatments. And what we've learned about the life cycle in South Dakota is we'll start out with the larvae. Now, every year I've been out collecting larvae every week, or life stages every week throughout the year. And what we find is that the first instar larvae, they go through 4 molts. So there's 4 instars of larvae. The first instar gets about as big as 1/4 of an inch. And they appear at about 650 to 900 growing degree days. And growing degree days base 50. So we're measuring the amount of time that it's above 50 degrees below 86. But that's generally about the middle of June in South Dakota. These larvae are so small, they're just threading their way through the phloem, the tissue that is moving sugars through the tree. They're barely doing any damage. They're so small. Now, about the 3rd week or the end of June, they molt to form the second instar. These are a little bigger, about 2/5 of an inch long, but notice they're still very, very small and are just threading their way through the phloem. They're really not doing a tremendous amount of disruption of sugars moving throughout the tree. But then when we start getting up to about 1,400 growing degree days, now we're getting into mid-July, about when hydrangeas start to bloom. Now the larvae are in their 3rd instar. They're about 3/4 of an inch long, and they're literally plowing through the tree. They're so thick that they're not only chewing through the entire phloem tissue, so they're disrupting that movement of sugars from the leaves to the roots, but they're also etching the sapwood where the water is moved. So think of this. They're now getting big enough that they're interrupting the flow of sugars through the tree and water up the tree. Obviously, at this stage, they're doing a tremendous amount of damage to the tree, and that continues to the 4th instar. The 4th instar we start seeing in August, and the 4th instar is going to be out until sometime in September and even early October. They're at about 1 inch and 1.25 inches long. About 32% are still feeding by the time we get into October, but they're just about done by then. But the damage they're doing in August and September is incredible. This is why we see a lot of the trees start collapsing at that point in the growing season, because we're getting that much disruption, not only of the sugars moving through the tree, but the water moving up the tree. Now, the 4th instar moves into the sapwood to overwinter in chambers as a J-shaped larvae. That happens in October. The point is, if you put a chemical in the tree in October, nobody's going to feed on it. They're at this point burrowed into the sapwood, have formed into what we call a J-shaped larvae. They're not feeding anymore once they form that chamber, and they'll remain in that chamber till the following spring. Now, I'm already getting pre-pupae in the trees down in Lincoln and Minnehaha County. And we've had them for a little bit longer down in Union County so far this year. But what happens is that J-shaped larvae kind of shrinks and straightens out and actually almost looks round, the one stage that does. But it's what we call a pre-pupae, and they're pre-pupae right now in the trees, but they're starting to become pupa. And pupa gradually take the shape of the adult insect. They got those eye spots, as you can see on this one. And we're just beginning to see a few of these forming because we're now getting into the middle of May. But by the end of May, usually about Memorial Day, it'll probably be a little sooner in Union County, you're going to start seeing the adults emerging. And so there's an adult coming out, and you can see how big they are, so to speak, as they're coming out of the wood. And they come out from a D-shaped hole that they carve, and there's the adult on my ring finger, so you get an idea of size to them. And you're going to find them out at about 500 to 550 growing degree days to about 1,200. So in other words, most of the population that's going to be flying is going to be flying in June and early July. Now, there are going to be some flying at the end of July and even a few into August. By the end of August, they're done flying. Any that emerged in early August are dead by the end of August. The adults only live about 3 to 4 weeks. And that's why for anyone in Sioux Falls, that's why they have that moratorium on moving ash between Memorial Day and Labor Day, because that's the time the adults could come out of the wood. Now, that is different from the state's quarantine. And it doesn't matter what time of the year. You cannot move hardwood, firewood, or unprocessed ash at any time of the year without a permit, a special permit to do so. And if you really want to look at when's the adults are flying, when black locust starts to bloom, usually about the end of May, we'll start seeing the adults coming out. About the time little leaf linden's in bloom, about 1,000 growing degree days, that's when we see about half of them they're going to emerge have already emerged. So about 3 weeks later, so think of it, in a 3-week time period, half of them they're going to emerge have emerged. And then it starts to decline in terms of emerging. Remember, they're going to fly for about 3 weeks. But by the time we get to hydrangeas blooming, just about all of them that are out, and then we get a few in late August and even some flying out in early August. They live for about 3 weeks. So again, by the time Labor Day shows up, none of them are flying anymore. Eggs are out about 600 to about 1,200 growing degree days is when we find most of the eggs are being laid at that time period. Well, so what's the importance of knowing that life cycle as well? Well, mom has to feed on ash leaves before she lays eggs. After she emerged, about a week, she's going to be feeding on ash leaves, sometimes 2 weeks, before she begins laying eggs. And so if we treat in May and early June, what we're going to find is we're going to kill mom before she even lays eggs. And if by some chance an adult lands on a tree without feeding on leaves but lays eggs on it, when those eggs hatch, you're going to kill very young larvae. So in other words, we're getting most of the bang from the buck. By doing the injections early in the season, you're going to get 2 years of effective treatments. In other words, treating the spring of 2023 is effective till the spring of 2025, and even a little beyond that, but essentially 2 full years plus. And you're going to kill every mom that's flying that lands on that tree to feed on the leaves. And you're going to kill any larvae that hatch, why they're very, very small. Now, what I've told companies is, yes, when you get a call in July and someone says, well, can you treat my tree? As long as the tree's getting adequate moisture, the tree can be treated. So let's say summer of 2023, someone says, well, I'm going to have my tree treated and I didn't get around to it and it's July. Well, it can be treated and you'll kill larvae that year, but the adults are pretty much done flying. And so what would be good is to switch over and start treating in the spring of 2025 for that. So the more treatments we can do early, the better. The other reason for that is what we call herd immunity. The idea, and we're studying this at South Dakota State University, and we'll finish up with our field season at the end of the summer, is what it looks like is that if a neighborhood treats about 1/3 of their trees, that provides protection to the remaining ash trees. How? Because you've treated enough ash trees that there's going to be quite a few adults that is a randomly feed on those trees and are killed. So notice it doesn't help on an individual tree in a yard. We're really looking at neighborhoods. So right now we're trying to get a sense of scale. How small of an area can you randomly treat 1/3 of the trees and provide protection to the surrounding trees? And we're really looking kind of at neighborhoods right now as being the scale. And the other thing is you want to treat low. Reason for that, and you can see all the injection ports done fairly low on the trunks of these trees. Reason for that is the lower you do it, the better the chemical uptake will be. So for homeowners that hire someone, again, what you'd like to see is as often as possible treating early in the season. All right, getting out there in May and early June to do the treatments. And treating them low on the tree and treating them shallow so that you're drilling in just beneath the bark. Why? Because remember, just beneath the bark, that outermost growth ring is what's moving the water through the tree. And the water movement is where the chemical is going to be moving as well. And so we occasionally see people that drill too deep into these trees, and you're not going to find that very effective either. You want to treat shallow, okay, low, and early. And by doing that, these treatments are near 100% effective. Every now and then you'll lose a tree, that happens, but it won't be a lot. So with that, this was kind of a quick update for it. Unfortunately, we've known emerald ash borer for a number of years now. So it's not that I have to explain what the insect is in great detail or as to what it'll do. But and we're going to be doing tree planting this afternoon here in Bryan, as I said, almost a gorgeous day to be planting trees to replace the ash population. It's going to be a little on the cooler side. It's cloudy, and hopefully a good rain coming up in the next couple of days that'll help water those in. What you see here for the ISA is the CEU code DS-23-012. And now I'll finish with the formal part of this. But if we have any questions, and I don't know if we do on my screen, I can't see them. So I rely on our moderator here, Tony, to let me know. But if there's any questions, now would be a good time to chat about them or go into a little bit more detail on any particular area that I've discussed. So, Tony?
And we do have one question from Becky. She asks, do treatments do any damage to the trees?
That's a good question. And yes, you know, it's what you're drilling into the tree that is going to cause some injury. But it's very, very, very minor injury. The modern technology of drilling, the companies know what wood bits to use that are going to literally carve their way, plane their way through the tree rather than burn their way into the tree. And the bits are replaced fairly frequently because they do have to be sharp. And every 2 years when they come back to drill the tree, they don't drill in the same area. So it really limits decay. And when I've looked at ash that were cut down that had been treated, and again, the reason they were cut down is the derecho, for example, last year that caused trees to fall over. You could see that very minimal decay. And by minimal, size of your finger decay, which the trees were able to wall off and wasn't harming them at all. So if you look at the cost benefit analysis, if you don't treat, they are going to die of emerald ash borer. That's just a given. Eventually they will die. If you do treat, yes, you're doing some damage to the tree, but it's very, very minimal damage that the tree can quickly grow over and then continue to grow. So as long as it's being done commercially following the guidelines, the injury is minimal and not a concern. But good question.
Wonderful. A couple more questions popping up here. Kind of a two-parter now. Has it been discovered if the emerald ash borer will infest any other species of trees? And someone chimed in about possible white fringe tree discoveries. What can you speak to that?
Right, and by the way, you'll see some reports out there of even them attacking olive trees. But you have to be careful with some of these reports. And I did some work like this on other growls 40 years ago. And that is, you carve into a tree, you pull the larvae out with a camel hair brush, and you insert it in another tree and see if it'll live. And you can get them to survive in olives. But note, mom didn't lay the egg on an olive tree and have it hatch and go in. You had to physically put it in there. The only exception to that is the white fringe tree. Now, white fringe tree is closely related to ash, very closely related to ash. And on that one, occasionally under high populations, an adult emerald ash borer will lay eggs on this tall shrub, small tree. The eggs will hatch, the larvae will feed and be able to complete their development and emerge. So yes, in the case of white fringe trees, they are able to successfully attack the trees and complete their development in them. Now, what I find interesting is ash dieback, which is a fungus disease, which is killing ash throughout Europe. If we were doing this talk in London right now, we'd be talking about the dying ash, but not from emerald ash borer, but from this fungus disease that was accidentally introduced from Asia that is killing their trees. Now, you know what that one does? It attacks only ash except for fringe tree. And I'm almost thinking somebody's going to do enough DNA work and they're going to decide that white fringe tree is just an ash tree. But the importance of that is that another plant which is related to ash trees, but not nearly as close, are lilacs. And that's why we have a native lilac ash borer. It attacks lilacs and it attacks ash trees. But there's never been any evidence of lilacs being attacked by the emerald ash borer. So at least we don't have to worry about that transfer. But absolutely correct. The white fringe tree is a risk, minimal, but it is an actual risk.
I see one more question in the chat right now. What about the movement of emerald ash borer along waterways? Could you provide some examples?
Yes, and let me start out with that. In many states, Minnesota is one of them. Early on when they found emerald ash borer, the one area people tend to give up on is riparian areas. And the reason why is we have a high concentration of ash. It is riparian species, and it's going to be almost impossible to manage it along those. You aren't going to cut out enough ash to provide a gap. Most people aren't going to treat that large population. So what's typically found is that there's two very good corridors for the movement of emerald ash borer. One is highways, because transporting wood from one community to the next is a good way to move it. And as they find is emerald ash borer can tumble off cars. And so we tend to find it along roadways. The other is riparian areas. In fact, in Lincoln County, you can follow some of the drainages, and all the ash trees there are hit sooner than the trees outside the drainage. So this is why, having found it in Dakota Dunes, my opinion is that we're probably going to confirm it over in Vermilion, Yankton, in a relatively short time period. It doesn't mean this year, but it's going to spread fairly rapidly up in that direction. So yes, riparian areas are another good corridor, but very difficult to manage.
And is that part of the reason those corridors being having such a high capacity for, or I guess potential for the spread? Is that why Minnesota focused their biocontrol releases along waterways?
That's one. I mean, you've got a very big habitat there, and obviously we've already done that to some degrees along the Big Sioux River. APHIS is in charge of that program, but we've been doing releases over in the Canton area and that, so that they can, it's probably where we're going to get our best bang for the buck. We're not going to be able to treat our way out of those areas. And back 20 years ago, almost 15 years ago, there was the attempt out east to try to cut a gap, a 10-mile gap, remove every ash tree along a riparian area for 10 miles. The idea being the beetles would not fly that far. One, you're never able to find every ash tree, and darn if the beetles can't fly a little farther if they have to. So merely trying to cut gaps in those along those riparian areas is not going to be effective. And remember, the natural enemies provide about 20% control. So look at them as a way of slowing the spread, not stopping the spread.
Well, that sounds like a fantastic way to end it. I don't have any questions in the chat box right now. If you do have any questions, you have Dr. Ball's phone number and email address there. You're always welcome to reach out to him or anybody else on the Forest Health team. We really appreciate everybody's attendance today. Dr. Ball, thank you for your time. One last call, if there is any Society of American Forester credentials that are wanted, please put your credentials in the chat box now. Any ISA arborists, please make sure to take that DS23012 code and apply that yourself on the ISA website. We look forward to next month's Forest Health Workshop. Dr. Ball, what can we look forward to next month?
Well, next month, we're going to be talking about defoliators and sap-sucking insects because they're going to be pretty hard at that point.
Perfect. Well, we will get an invitation out soon. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.